So let's talk about historical causes of diffusion. We're going to look at the past and look at some major examples of diffusion. So we're going to look at trade, we're going to look at imperialism and colonialism, we're going to look at a lot of religious diffusion. There's a lot of stuff we're going to cover here because a lot of stuff has happened in the past. And so when we look at these historical causes of diffusion, we're looking at interactions between and among cultural state traits and larger global forces that can lead to new forms of cultural expression. And maybe this cultural expression is temporary or it's more long lasting, and we see it today. We may even see the effects of this expression in these behaviors today. And the main processes we're looking at is colonialism, imperialism, and trade. This is what shapes the patterns and practices of cultures in different areas. And they all kind of deal with interactions among different people and different cultures, and that changes their cultural traits as they engage with one another. Now, something that students commonly ask me are the differences between colonialism and imperialism. And I'm not going to go into any kind of explanation on the differences here, but I will tell you is do not worry about the differences. You will not be asked on the AP exam what the differences are. You will not be asked to define imperialism. College Board, I don't even think College Board knows the difference between these two terms, and they do that a lot in different courses. They don't really know the definition to them, or the definition can be a little subjective, so they're not going to ask you that on the AP exam. But you can use it in your question or in your answers or questions on the AP exam. So don't be afraid of these terms. They're not going to haunt you. Now, there are so many historical examples of diffusion, but we're going to go over some of the most major ones, also some pretty cool and interesting ones as well. Kind of keep this engaging. So the first one, the one you're probably a little familiar with, is the Columbian Exchange. And this was just the movement of people between the Old World and the New World being the Americas. And that resulted in the exchange of different plants, animals, different diseases, and technologies. When we're talking about foods, we know different foods like tomatoes, potatoes. Those all went through the Columbian Exchange as they went through the Old World to the New World, or the New World to the Old World. We consider those plants because you grow them. So we see crops like potatoes, maize, tomatoes, and cocoa that were introduced to Afro-Eurasia from the Americas. So these are indigenous to the Americas. Before the Columbian Exchange, they didn't have tomatoes in the Americas. Same thing with potatoes. And look at Ireland. Ireland grows a lot of potatoes now. Why? Because of the Columbian Exchange. We see crops like rice, wheat, sugarcane, and coffee that are originally from Afro-Eurasia, and they were introduced to the Americas. So before the Columbian Exchange, they didn't have any coffee in the Americas. They didn't have any rice. We saw the exchange of animals like turkey and llamas to Europe, as well as horses and cattle and sheep to the Americas. Europeans gave the Americas different diseases like smallpox, the flu, and malaria, and that led to a lot of death of the indigenous populations in the Americas. 90% of the natives had no immunity or some kind of resistance to these diseases because they'd never seen them before. And the Americas, they were not alone in this disease transport. They gave Europeans syphilis. And I will say this, you don't really see anyone get smallpox anymore, but you still see people get syphilis. We'll just ignore the flu and malaria. Now, all this led to long-term ecological shifts in both hemispheres because we're growing a lot more different crops now that haven't been grown there before, and that's going to impact the environment. We see a lot more interconnected world and global trade. This is kind of the start of global trade. We see new agriculture economies develop with new commercial agriculture because there's a lot more different crops to grow, a lot more cash crops as well, like coffee that you don't necessarily need, but you can sell it for because people want it. And we also just see a lot of culture exchange be influenced as well because we're interacting with different people of different cultures. So we're going to see a different culture exchange, like ways to grow crops or religion or ideologies. Now, what kind of diffusion is the Columbian Exchange as a whole? We see the movement of people, we see the movement of plants, animals, diseases, and technologies across the Atlantic Ocean. What kind of diffusion is that? So let's look here at a map here showing just more transport. This is a big deal. We see a lot of foods that we know today go to Europe, and a lot of foods that we know today come from the Europe, Afro-Eurasia continent, like citrus fruits and bananas. These aren't native to the Americas. They came from Afro-Eurasia. Same thing with like peanuts and corn and turkeys. Those came from North America and went to Europe. They were relocated there, and that might help you answer your diffusion question. Let's look at Christianity now. Let's look at how Christianity has diffused. What type of diffusion is this? The migration of Christians to Europe and across the Roman Empire facilitated by the Roman road network. This is relocation diffusion because we're just talking about the migration, the relocation of people. What about this one here? Europeans practicing their Christian faith in the Americas. That's also relocation diffusion. They came from Europe. Now they're in the Americas, and they're practicing their Christian faith. They're not really growing it. We're not really looking at the expansion of the Christianity religion here. That's what expansion diffusion is. What about this one here? This is a very specific example. Emperor Constantine of the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. So we see growth, and we see the legalization of the religion via the Edict of Milan. The faith continued to spread across the empire's institutions and officials, and inevitably spread to the people. So we know that this is an example of expansion diffusion because Christianity is growing as a concept, as a religion here, as a way of life. Now, how did it spread? It spread from a top-down approach. It went from the emperor to the people, and we know that as hierarchical diffusion. What about this one here? This is stimulus diffusion. I just didn't put the animation in for some reason. After Spanish colonization in Latin America, the Catholic religion, which is just a branch of the Christianity religion, was introduced to native populations, and the Virgin of Guadalupe, who appeared to a native peasant, Juan Diego, became a symbol of Mexican Catholics. And this figure here incorporates elements of the indigenous beliefs of the region, like characteristics of the Aztec goddess Tonantzin. I don't know how to say that. But yeah, what we see here is stimulus diffusion because we see that they took the Catholic religion and they changed it a little bit. It adapted to their native area, and that is stimulus diffusion. It still grew in popularity, but it's changed. It's different than where it once was, where its hearth was, for instance. Now let's look at creolization. Creolization, we look at Creole languages when we talk about creolization, but creolization is just the blending of different ideologies. When we talk about Creole languages, we're looking at the blending of different languages to make a new one. And so that new language is going to contain elements of both original languages. Maybe it's more than two original languages, but it's going to contain elements of each of them. It's going to be very simplified. There's going to be a lot of mixed vocabulary. We're going to see vocab from all the languages that it stems from, as well as very distinct pronunciations. You're going to know someone speaking the Creole language. We look at an example here like Haitian Creole, which is spoken in Haiti, other parts of the Caribbean, as well as a small part of Florida. It was developed in Haiti from a mixture of French, who were the colonizers, as well as the West African languages spoken by the enslaved Africans that are in Haiti. And this has like 10 to 12,000 people still speaking it. So it's still relatively large. Not as large as, languages like English or Mandarin, but still relatively large compared to other Creole languages. And this Creole language blends vocabulary from French with African grammar and pronunciation here. Creole is based on English with influences from Yoruba, Igbo, and other West African languages, as well as Portuguese, and that's the colonizer of this region in West Africa. So we see a lot of different cultural groups, a lot of different ethnic groups in West Africa. They speak various different languages, and this language, Creole, is based on English, Portuguese, and a bunch of other West African languages to make their own distinct Creole language. It developed among freed slaves who actually returned to West Africa from the Americas and the Caribbean. And we have Louisiana Creole, which is based on French because the French colonized Louisiana. And it has influences from West African languages, from slaves, as well as Native American languages, as well as Spanish. Remember, France and Spain, they're right next to each other. And it's actually still spoken from small communities within the state, a few different counties. We're actually going to look at that here. Only about a few thousand people still speak Louisiana Creole, though, and it's not a language they're really passing on to future generations, so it may die out sooner or later. So we can see here, it's not really spoken across a lot of different areas of Louisiana. It's not spoken across the whole state, only in distinct communities, particularly closer to New Orleans in that Gulf of Mexico here. There's that one little parish in the middle of the state. And the reason that it's spoken closer to the water in the Gulf of Mexico is that's where most people lived back in the day, because water is good for agriculture, it's good for trade, it's good for transportation. People like to live near water, and that's where we typically have seen developments start out, and that's where clusters of people originally lived. And it's actually still like that today. Most people still live near coasts or rivers and other bodies of water. So we have a bunch of other different examples of languages that are either pidgin languages or Creole languages. A pidgin language, do you see that term there? That's just a language that's created for communication purposes. It's also very, very weak in its grammar structure, and it's literally made just for communication. It's very, very basic. You just want to get the point across. Don't worry too much about pidgin languages. Creole languages is something College Board likes a lot more. And we can see a lot of different examples from a lot of different influences. Like for English, we see Hawaii, Gola. We see Jamaica, the Nigerian Pidgin English. We look at Spanish, they have that Cocoliche language. In German, I'm actually not even going to pronounce that, but we see some for French, like Louisiana Creole or Haitian, because the French colonized these areas. And we see other Creole languages as well, like Russian Norsuk or Chinook Jargon, which is definitely from European origin. Let's talk about the printing press. This is just an example I thought would be pretty cool to talk about because it's very, very important, and it's influenced printing today because the printing press led to the diffusion of knowledge, ideas, as well as religious texts because you can distribute ink to paper a lot more quickly and at higher rates and just do it more efficiently. And it's actually a pretty new invention. It's only about 600 something years old because it was created in the 14th century, and it greatly accelerated diffusion of ideas and concepts and information. And it made books more affordable and more accessible. Books used to be a lot more expensive before the printing press, and now that the printing press exists, we have a lot more greater technology as a result of developments of the printing press. We have printers now. Yay! Electronic printers are pretty cool, though, I will say. And that's led to the increase in literacy among the general population. Previously, books were expensive and they were very labor intensive to produce because, you got to write everything down. And they were often limited to religious institutions or just the elite, the wealthy people who could afford books. Basically, the commoners can now afford books. And if you're an 8-year-old kid watching this, you're probably groaning. It's like, now I have to read because of this stupid guy. Come on, Jonas. I don't like you. Yeah. You can blame that guy for all your reading problems and doing your summer reading. Books be printed in vernacular languages such as German, French, and English. They be printed in all kinds of languages that different groups spoke rather than just the Latin language, which is all these languages are influenced by. And this led to the standardization and kind of official use of these languages. And it was instrumental in the Protestant Reformation, if you've ever read about that. If you haven't, that's okay. Where Martin Luther nailed his 95 Thesis to the church, and his writings and other pamphlets, treatises, and essays questioning the established order of the church were spread rapidly. And this fueled revolutionary movements and the growth of Protestantism in England and beyond. Wow, that's so cool. The printing press is pretty cool because you don't have to write down a book every time you sell one. You don't have to write the whole thing down. Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace, if you ever heard of that. It's a very long book. It only takes a few days to read. His wife wrote the book numerous times by hand after he originally wrote it, which is miraculous to me because writing something down is way longer. It takes way more work than to read something. Let's look at a past FRQ from 2024. We're going to describe the process of creolization of a language. So this is supposed to be a freebie part here, but a lot of people probably don't know what creolization is, but you do. So how do we describe this process of creolization of a language? Well, we can see that there's, for one, interactions between cultures or culture traits, or maybe some kind of larger global force. We see that a lot today because of globalization, and that leads to new forms of cultural expression as well as new languages. The other definitions, one I probably think you would probably say the most, is that two or more languages converge or mix. You could also say blend, and that creates a new language or a new form of communication. And most of you probably added on with distinct traits or traits that come from both languages, something like that. We could also say people speaking two or more languages experience syncretism. That's kind of the word here. When we talk about the blend or the mix of these languages, the term for that is syncretism. And they combine these languages to form a new language. We also say the development of a new language or dialect occurs due to contact between groups that speak different and or mutually unintelligible languages here. So something that you should also take away is that creolization and a lot of cultural exchange typically comes from direct contact. When we're talking about historical context, we don't have the internet in the past. The internet's very, very new, newer than the printing press, if you didn't know that. And so direct context what facilitated cultural exchange back in historical times, just ancient times and modern times even. The blending of two or more languages in which the new language includes selected features of either the original language. That's something else I think you would add. So most people would probably say the second point and the last point kind of together here, but College Board, I guess, doesn't expect you to know that much. So just saying one or the other would actually get you the point for this question here. Let's talk about the Silk Road. This is something that a lot of AP Human teachers talk about. College Board seems to like this as an example, so we'll go over it. So the ancient Silk Road connected Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa, the Afro-Eurasia landmass, and facilitated the diffusion of different goods, technologies, ideas, as well as religions through this direct contact. Chinese silk was highly coveted by elite classes in Europe. The Chinese made some really precious, really epic silk, I guess, and the Europeans, at least the wealthy Europeans and the elite Europeans, really loved it. And in the Middle East, they also loved it for its beauty, as well as just viewing it as a luxury. All the commoners didn't have silk. They don't have something so nice. We look at the diffusion of religion, like Buddhism. It spread from India to China and East Asia. We see Islam spread to Central Asia as well as China as well. We look at goods like spices. It always dealt with the spices, guys. They went thousands of miles for spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. They went for precious stones. I hope those stones were worth all the trouble. But they went for glassware, porcelain. That came from China. Tea, paper, gunpowder, ivory, horses. If you don't know what ivory is, it comes from the tusks of elephants. We can look at exotic animals. All of this diffused along this Silk Road. It went from relocation to diffusion. We see crops like sugar, grapes, cotton, and wheat. These were all exchanged as well. Wheat's native to the Afro-Eurasian landmass. It went to the Americas from the Columbian exchange. Now let's talk about another linguistic term, lingua franca. When I say linguistic, I'm just talking about languages here. I'm not getting so fancy on y'all, I promise. So what is a lingua franca? A lingua franca is a language that facilitates communication or trade between people who speak different native languages. So a very, very broad and unspecific example is someone from Spain, they speak Spanish, and someone from France, they speak French, they speak English. That's their communicational language. That's their lingua franca. There we go. Easy example. So English, for the most part, is the worldwide lingua franca. It's the most commonly used. All air traffic control operators must speak English. English dominates as the primary language of the internet and technological platforms. It's a dominant language in academic publishing, scientific research, and international conferences. English is a big deal. The global spread of English language media, such as films from Hollywood, music and television and literature, reinforces its role as a lingua franca because people consuming this form of entertainment and media are being consumed with English, and they're being exposed to English, and if they want to understand English music, they have to know English. Many non-English speaking countries adopt English as a second language in their educational system. We see this in a lot of countries that were colonized by England, a lot of countries in Africa, for instance, or India. Another lingua franca, it's not as big as English, is Swahili, and it's used across East Africa, particularly in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and a bunch of different countries in Africa. It's not really worldwide like English is, but it's used a lot in Africa. Mandarin, which is the most spoken language in the world, is a lingua franca across Asia, particularly East Asia. It's as Mandarin's a lingua franca within China and abroad, and that expands China's global influence. China has a lot of influence across the world when it comes to labor, when it comes for production and trade, and other people speaking language that they speak there, Mandarin. It's going to facilitate a lot more interaction as well as grow their influence. Let's look at another FRQ. We're talking about lingua franca. It doesn't say that directly, but when we're talking about the worldwide use of language like English, we're talking about lingua franca. So we're going to describe one historical factor that's led to the worldwide use of English. British colonialism or imperialism. A lot of the stuff we talk about in this course just comes down to imperialism. And that's a trend you'll notice as we finish up this unit here. So just a brief explanation of this is that the British Empire extended to all continents, and many former colonies still use English as an official language. Naval, military, and economic dominance spread the language as well. Look at the role of the U.S. military. Overseas base locations or threats of operation result in English usage in local communities or businesses. We see this in the Philippines and Central America, the Caribbean, Pacific Islands, Europe, Korean Peninsula, and Japan, anywhere where there's maybe U.S. military bases or a lot of U.S. military interaction. We look at American diplomatic and or economic power, so the founding of supranational organizations such as the UN or the World Trade Organization, or just the emergence of the U.S. as a core region with a lot of multinational corporations. We can look at Apple as a big example of one, Coke. All of these come from America, and so English is going to be the language that they're predominantly going to use. And when you have a supranational organization like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization, these countries have to communicate in some way with one another, and English is the language they're using. The UN headquarters is actually located in New York City. We look at the migration of English speakers. We see the movement of native English speakers to non-English parts of the world. As typically colonists, we look at Argentina and Israel as notable examples, as well as returning migrants bringing English back to their native countries. Look at early global popularity of English language arts. We talked about this with the media. So film, theater, literature, Shakespeare is big worldwide. We look at Mark Twain as well as Jane Austen as notable examples. We look at religion as well. Missionaries in mission schools, scriptural translations into English like the ESV Bible, and literature from the Reformation onward, such as the King James Bible or the Book of Common Prayer. We look at spatial diffusion of British Protestantism as well. So we talk about that Protestant Reformation a lot when we were talking about the printing press, and this kind of is fueled by it because they printed a lot of Bibles and different translations of the Bibles in English, and so it spread religion in English, and they read it in English, so they knew English, and that grew the worldwide use of English. Yeah, I said English a lot today. Wow. Finally, English is seen as just a social status symbol among the global elite. This is post 1800s, very, very contemporary. We see English boarding schools, we see university education like Oxford and Cambridge. These are in England, as well as just private English tutors as well. It's just seen as a cool thing to know English. Like, wow, you know English? That's great. I don't even know English, even though I'm saying this in English. All right, let's move on to the Berlin Conference. This is a big deal, especially in AP Human Geography. So if you're taking notes, you're doing my guided notes, or you're listening along, trying to learn for the AP exam or your class, pay attention because College Board loves the Berlin Conference. So the Berlin Conference, it happened in 1884 and 1885, so relatively recent. You're probably born after it. This was a meeting among European countries to discuss the partitioning of Africa for colonization. Basically, who gets what parts of Africa. It established what's known as the Scramble for Africa. The European countries, Spain, Italy, Portugal, England, Belgium, France, Germany, they all wanted a chunk of Africa. They all wanted a part of the continent and turned them into colonial territories. And they disregarded the existing African populations and the cultural differences, the political boundaries already established. They just saw that as insignificant. And so when they established these new boundaries and new divisions within Africa, it led to a lot of political disruption, instability, and disrupted the social order here. It facilitated the exploitations of Africa's natural resources they didn't have in Europe or they were running low of, as well as the exploitation of African labor. We could see the benefits, see that it benefited European economies because it was cheap labor, cheap resources, and it impoverished and didn't benefit the local populations of Africa as much, or if at all. If anything, they were at the disadvantage. If that's something to take away, Africa was at the disadvantage compared to Europe. Europe was going through the Industrial Revolution, so their economies were booming, and they wanted to continue that economic flourishment. So they looked to Africa as a way to get resources for production as well as labor, or as well as markets to sell their goods and services. So here is a map of Africa after the Scramble for Africa, where they partitioned the different parts. So we could see that they kind of tried to cluster the countries together. Some countries got more of Africa than others. Like Spain really only got 3 parts of Africa, 3 countries today. This is the modern countries today. When they partitioned this, they didn't establish the countries. They're like, oh, this is Algeria, this is Mali. No, they just consider that French West Africa, or they consider this British Africa. They really only left one little free part of Africa. I don't really know why. They have a reason for it. We can see Germany's got some chunks here. The Portuguese got some chunks. French got Madagascar and the whole Western Africa. Italy's got the Horn in that kind of north area, west of Egypt. We could see here that the Portuguese got some little parts. And yeah, we could see that they all wanted a little chunk of Africa. Belgium got the Congo area, which is a pretty big landmass, actually. So yeah, that's Africa. Well, not anymore. These countries have established independence for the most part. So let's get past FRQ. So we talked about the concept of ethnocentrism in 3.1. Remember, ethnocentrism is believing that your culture is above other people's cultures. You could also say that ethnocentrism is just judging a culture through your own perspective, your own cultural viewpoint. So how does the European colonization of Africa reflect this concept of ethnocentrism? So European colonizers had bias disregard for the African cultural groups, and that reflected ethnocentrism because they were racist. They showed prejudice. They thought that their culture, their nation was superior to the African nations. We'd also say that European colonizers tend to claim dominion over the African people, their lands, and their natural resources. Based upon this expansionist idea, they wanted to expand their rule and their exploitation and extraction. They wanted to colonize certain parts of Africa. So those parts of Africa were deemed as parts of the European countries. Africans educated in European institutions during colonialism were wrongly taught that their ancestors were European, which is something that they actually did, and in attempts to absorb Africans into this ethnocentric worldview of Europe, where Europe is kind of the center of the world. Now, why did they colonize Africa? We kind of talked about this briefly with the Industrial Revolution and the resources and so on, but let's get a little more specific here. They wanted, of course, to grow their economies. European powers wanted new markets to sell their goods, as well as get access to valuable natural resources like minerals, rubber, as well as agriculture products like cotton, tea, cocoa, and of course, spices. It always has to go with spices, guys. They love spices, because all of these crops here, you don't necessarily need them all, but they're nice to have. They're cash crops, and they can commercially grow them and sell them for lots of money. We also see nationalism. Countries want to expand their empires to enhance national prestige and power. This is kind of going back with that ethnocentric view. They want to compete as well with each other for territory, because it looks cool to have as much land as possible, because bigger is better. We look at strategic interests. Colonies provided strategic military and naval bases. This allowed for enhanced global influence and control over trade routes, and that kind of goes back to the economies. We also look at the religious motivations, because these European countries were Christian, and so they had these missionary efforts to spread Christianity as well as Western values, and they often justify colonization as a moral obligation to spread Christianity, and that's something they did in Africa, and a lot of African countries like Nigeria have large Christian populations. We also look at kind of deals with nationalism, kind of doesn't. We look at social Darwinism, where it's that ethnocentrism, where they feel superiority of their culture and their race, promoting the idea that it is their duty to civilize the quote-unquote lesser societies through colonization. So the Berlin Conference led to a lot of diffusion. Let's look at this. So relocation diffusion, where they're just moving. We see European colonizers moving to Africa. That brought their cultures, their languages like French, Spanish, English, as well as their religions, leading to the establishment of European cultural practices in the colonies like schools and farming methods and land use. We look at contagious diffusion, like the spread of Christianity through missionaries. That led to the rapid adoption of Christian practices and beliefs among different ethnic groups. We look at stimulus diffusion as local farmers began to grow coffee and cocoa alongside traditional African crops like yams and millet, and that led to diversified farming systems where they're growing different crops now. We look at hierarchical diffusion, where European powers imposed their political and economic structures on African society, spreading Western ideals from colonial capitals. And French West Africa, particularly the French educational system, because they established the educational institutions in the African colonies, as well as the French language spread outward from the major cities that the French were located in, as well as to the surrounding rural areas. We look at elements of African culture like art, music, and agriculture practices actually spreading back to Europe in various ways. We see famous artists like Picasso and Henri Matisse, I don't know how to say that. It drew heavily from African art, incorporating African masks and sculptures into the works, while they're also including different European elements as well. The exposure of European artists to African art during the colonial period, the post-Berlin Conference, after they established who gets what when they're actually colonizing it, led to the fascination with traditional African artistic styles. Mikey likes it. They thought the art looked cool, so they kind of blended it, used elements from European art and elements of African art to make new art forms. And this led to the influence of Picasso and other artists who incorporated African motifs and aesthetics into their work, contributing to the development of modern art movements in Europe. This diffusion helped elevate Africans' art status in the global art scene, and we can look at just infrastructure in general. That's the other thing College Board likes, is infrastructure. For example, we see the Congo Ocean Railway. The French built this to connect the port city of Pointe-Noire to the interior of the Congo, and this promoted the movement of goods, especially rubber and timber. We're looking at those natural resources from the interior to the coast. And once they got to the coast, they would ship them out on boats back to France, and they would manufacture them or use them however they may like here. So they put in infrastructure to fuel that economic growth. Pretty cool. All right, let's look at some more examples of diffusion. The English and German languages influenced the Swahili language, which is a Bantu language enriched by Arabic, Portuguese, and later English vocabulary. So the Swahili language is actually a lingua franca spoken a lot in East Asia, has its roots in a lot of different languages here. And this led to the widespread use of Swahili as a lingua franca in the region because it facilitated trade and communication across the diverse ethnic groups because it has similar vocabulary to these major languages like English and German and Arabic that they speak there. In Nigeria and other countries, the Anglican Church and other denominations of Christianity spread, and it resulted in the conversion of millions of Africans to the Christian religion. Farmers adapted their agriculture practices to incorporate new farming techniques, such as improved pruning methods, optimizing yields and efficiency. And they did this particularly with cocoa. They saw that cocoa is great for these better farming methods to increase their efficiency in their yield. And yeah, that's pretty interesting how they changed their whole farming practice because of cocoa from Europe. And this increased cocoa production immensely, and it transformed Ghana, which is a country on the coast of the Western Africa by Nigeria, into one of the world's largest cocoa producers. And that brings in a lot of revenue to the country, as well as shaping local diets, because they're going to grow crops that grow best with these conditions, as well as growing best with the cocoa production. Boom. Let's look at FRQ 2021. Describe one historical reason for India's current number of English speakers. India was colonized by Britain. We know that, and we can talk about that. India has many English speakers because of its colonial history as a part of the British Empire. And boom, that's all you would have to say to get the point. You could also say, after India gained its independence from British rule in 1947, you probably don't have to say the date. You could probably just say gained its independence from British rule. After that, English remained as one of the India's official languages. It's not the only official language, but it's one of them. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really does help me out, and it costs $0. I have some free resources for you in the description down below if you'd like to use them. If you have any AP Human Geography related questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below the video or send me a message on Discord. I'll see you guys in the next video, though. Adios.